There are moments in life when something extraordinary crosses your path, something your soul recognizes before your mind can even name it. But instead of opening your arms, you find yourself closing doors, building walls, moving away from what you most long for. And what comes next is not simply the absence of a person, it is the beginning of a profound psychological transformation that Carl Jung described with astonishing precision in his works. Because rejecting a soulmate is not like letting go of just any relationship. It is denying a fundamental part of your own individuation process. That path toward wholeness, Jung considered the supreme purpose of human existence. Imagine for a moment that your psyche is like a house with many rooms. Some are lit, you know them well. They are your conscious personality, what you show the world. But there are other rooms that are dark, locked, filled with contents you've repressed, denied, or simply never explored. Jung called this the shadow, and he also identified what he termed the anima in men and the animus in women. Those inner forces that represent the contrasexual aspectos de nuestra psique. Cuando un alma gemela aparece, esa persona actúa como un espejo perfecto de estas dimensiones ocultas. They show you who you really are, beyond social masks, beyond the ego you have carefully constructed. And when you reject them, you are rejecting the most powerful opportunity to know yourself in depth. The first thing that happens when you reject that love is that you experience what Jung described as a psychic dissociation. Your conscious self separates even further from your unconscious self. It's as if you were raising an even thicker inner wall between who you think you are and who you really are. You begin to feel a strange disconnection from yourself, as if you were performing in your own life instead of fully living it. Your decisions seem to come from an automatic, reactive place rather than from an authentic center. Jung observó que cuando las personas evitan los encuentros más significativos con su totalidad psíquica, desarrollan lo que él llamó una neurosis, no necessarily in the clinical sense, but as a fragmentation of being that keeps you from accessing your full vital energy. You become rigid, predictable, trapped in patterns that no longer serve you, but that you repeat because your ego fears the unknown that true love represents. The second consequence is something you may already be feeling if you've been through this. A constant restlessness appears, a sense that something fundamental is missing in your life, yet you can't identify exactly what it is. Jung habló extensamente acerca de la función trascendente, el proceso psicológico por el cual los opuestos dentro de ti buscan reconciliation and create something new. The soulmate is precisely the catalyst that activates this function. When you reject them, you halt this natural process of transformation, and your psyche enters a state Jung described as stagnation. The psychic energy that should be flowing toward your evolution gets trapped. It stagnates, and you begin to feel empty inside, even if you have external success, superficial relationships, or a life that looks perfect on paper. But that restlessness does not leave you because your soul knows you rejected its evolution. Now then, the third thing that occurs is perhaps one of the most painful. You start to project. Jung dedicó años enteros a estudiar la proyección psicológica, ese mecanismo por el cual usted coloca contenidos internos en personas o situaciones externas. When you reject a soulmate, your psyche does not simply forget that connection. Instead, it begins desperately searching for that same quality in other people, places, or situations. But here is what's crucial. You never find it in the same way, because you are projecting the totality of your own unrealized potential. You begin an endless search in which each new person you meet seems promising at first, but the magic quickly fades because it's not really about them. It's about you looking outside for what you rejected within. Jung was very clear about this. Projection is unconscious by nature, so you don't even realize you're caught in this cycle until you've repeated the pattern dozens of times. The fourth consequence has to do with what Jung called inflation of the ego. When you reject a soulmate, your ego needs to justify that decision. It cannot simply admit it was afraid, that it failed to meet the challenge of growth, so it begins to weave elaborate narratives about why that person wasn't right, why you deserve something better, why your path is superior to surrendering to that kind of vulnerability. Your ego swells, it becomes more defensive, more critical, more closed. Jung advirtió que cuando el ego infla como este, en realidad se vuelve más frágil, no más fuerte, porque está operando desde un lugar compensatorio, trying to cover the deep wound of having rejected your own potential for wholeness. You become more stubborn in your opinions, more resistant to anything that challenges your worldview, further from the humility true psychological growth requires. The fifth thing that happens is something Jung repeatedly observed in his patients. Compensatory dreams appear. Your unconscious does not remain silent when you reject something so significant. It begins sending you messages through dreams, sometimes disturbing, sometimes beautiful, but always insistent. You dream of the person you rejected, or of symbols that represent what they meant for your individuation. You dream of closed doors you try to open, of trains you miss, of roads not taken. Jung entendió los sueños como la forma natural de la psique de buscar el equilibrio. When your conscious life is thrown off by the rejection of an essential connection, your dream life becomes more intense, more symbolic, more urgent in its attempt to show you what you left behind. And if you ignore these dreams, if you pay no attention to these messages, the inner tension only increases. The sixth thing you experience is what Jung called the loss of vital energy or psychic libido. He was not speaking only of sexual energy, though that can be affected as well, but of that life force that makes you feel alive, motivated, connected to the meaning of your existence. When you reject a soulmate, it's as if you shut down an important source of this energy. Jung explicó que el libido psíquico fluye naturalmente hacia lo que lleva significado para nuestra totalidad. By rejecting that love, you are blocking that natural flow. You feel more tired for no apparent reason, more apathetic toward things you used to be passionate about, more disconnected from your purpose. This isn't necessarily clinical depression, though it can evolve into that if unattended. It is what Jung called an existential neurosis, that sensation of being alive but not truly living. Now we arrive at the seventh consequence, which is particularly subtle yet devastating. You lose access to your capacity for psychological synthesis. Jung habló de la síntesis como el proceso por el cual integramos experiencias opuestas y contradictorias en una comprensión más elevada de nosotros mismos. The soulmate represents one of the greatest polarities you can experience. The other who is simultaneously entirely different from you and deeply familiar, someone who challenges and accepts you, confronts and supports you. By rejecting this experience, you lose practice in holding paradoxes, in integrating contradictions. Your thinking becomes more binary, more rigid, an either-or. You lose the capacity for what Jung called symbolic thinking, the ability to see multiple levels of meaning and experience. You grow literal, superficial in your understanding of yourself and others, because you rejected the most deeply symbolic experience there is, the encounter with the soulmate. El octavo cosa que ocurre es que tu sombra se vuelve más densa y más activa. Remember, the shadow contains everything you have repressed, denied, or failed to integrate. When you reject a soulmate, you massively feed your shadow with everything that person represented for you, perhaps vulnerability you cannot show, perhaps passion you fear feeling, perhaps intimacy you deem dangerous. These contents do not disappear just because you shut the door on that person. They accumulate in your shadow and begin to manifest in ways Jung called indirect or projected. Suddenly you find yourself becoming exactly what you used to criticize, having disproportionate emotional reactions to small situations, feeling envies or resentments you can't rationally explain. Your shadow is growing and gaining power precisely because you refuse the chance to illuminate those dark rooms of your psyche through true love. And finally, the ninth consequence is perhaps the deepest from a Jungian perspective. You move away from your individuation, the unique path to becoming who you truly are. Jung dedicó su vida entera a entender este proceso. Él explicó que no nacemos completos, nacemos con un potencial de totalidad que debemos realizar a través de experiencias conscientes. Individuation is not a comfortable process. It requires facing your deepest fears, integrating your rejected aspects, embracing your uniqueness, even when the world asks you to conform. The soulmate is one of the most powerful catalysts for this process because they force you to meet yourself through the mirror of the other. When you reject them, you're essentially telling your soul that you're not ready to grow, that you prefer the comfort of who you already are to the discomfort of becoming who you could be. And your psyche registers this rejection, not as a moral judgment, but as a direction taken, a path not followed. And that choice has consequences that ripple across your whole life. But here comes something crucial that Jung understood deeply. None of this is irreversible. The psyche has a natural tendency toward healing, toward wholeness. Jung llamó a esta función teleológica del inconsciente, esa orientación inherente hacia el crecimiento e integración. If you are experiencing some or all of these 9 consequences, your psyche is not punishing you, it is calling you. It is telling you there is still time to turn toward yourself, to do the integrative work you've been avoiding. You may not be able to recover that specific person, perhaps that ship has sailed, but what you never lose is the opportunity to find within yourself what that person represented. Jung trabajó con cientos de personas que llegaron a él sintiendo exactamente lo que usted puede estar sintiendo ahora, esa sensación de haber perdido algo irreplaceable, of being trapped in patterns that lead nowhere, of feeling life slipping through your fingers. And what he discovered again and again is that the path back to vitality always passes through the same place. You must face what you've been avoiding. You must look directly at your shadow instead of fleeing it. You must recognize your projections instead of continuing to search outside. You must allow your ego to deflate and become humble before the mystery of your own depth. The work Jung proposed is not easy. It requires what he called moral courage, the bravery to look at yourself without masks, without justifications, without the stories you've told yourself to feel better. It requires that you sit with the discomfort of recognizing that you rejected something sacred because you were afraid. And yes, it was fear, even if you called it by other names. Prudence, realism, self-protection, independence. Deep down, when we reject a soulmate, it's almost always because some part of us knows that connection would transform us in ways we cannot control, and the ego hates not being in control. Jung habló de lo que él llamó nigredo, la fase oscura del proceso alquímico que usó como metáfora del viaje psicológico. It is that moment when everything you thought you knew about yourself crumbles, when you face your emptiness, your existential loneliness, your own capacity for self-betrayal. Rejecting a soulmate often takes you straight into this nigredo, this darkening. But Jung also knew that on the other side of this darkness comes what the alchemists called the albedo, the whitening, a renewed clarity in which you can finally see honestly who you are and what truly matters. The darkness is not the end, it is the crucible where real transformation occurs. Let me be very direct about something Jung understood perfectly, but our modern culture often ignores. Not all wounds heal quickly. You cannot simply read a book, take a weekend workshop, or repeat positive affirmations and expect the pain of having rejected a soulmate to vanish. This kind of wound is what Jung called a wound of the soul, not merely of the ego. It touches the deepest layers of your being. Healing requires time, patience with yourself, and a willingness to fully feel what you've been avoiding. Jung pasó horas, a veces años, con sus pacientes porque él entendía que la transformación psicológica verdadera no puede apresurarse. There is something else you need to understand about this process. Jung observó que cuando rechazamos algo significativo en nuestras vidas, no solo afectamos nuestro presente y futuro, sino que reactivamos heridas pasadas. This wasn't the first time you rejected love, your own authenticity, or chose safety over expansion. There is probably a pattern that goes back to childhood, to your earliest experiences of vulnerability that were not well received. Jung habló del complejo de la madre y del complejo del padre, aquellas constelaciones psíquicas formadas en nuestras primeras relaciones que luego colorean todas nuestras conexiones adultas. When you reject a soulmate, you're often repeating an ancestral pattern that isn't even yours. It's something inherited from your family, your culture, from generations of people who were also afraid of their own wholeness. And this is where the work becomes truly interesting and powerful. Jung descubrió que cuando finalmente enfrentas estos patrones, cuando traes luz consciente a estas dinámicas inconscientes, no solo te liberas, you also free something in the collective field. Él habló del inconsciente colectivo, esa capa de la psique que todos compartimos, donde residen los arquetipos universales. When you do your individual work of integration, when you heal your relationship with love, vulnerability, and your own soul, you contribute to a broader healing. Not in a mystical or abstract way, but in a very concrete one. You become a different model. You break generational chains. You radiate a quality of presence that affects everyone around you. Now you may be wondering what to do specifically if you recognize that you rejected a soulmate and are experiencing these 9 consequences. Jung was not one to give simple advice or quick formulas, but he did offer clear directions. First, you need to do what he called shadow work. This means sitting in meditation, deep reflection, or, better yet, in therapy, and honestly asking yourself which aspects of yourself you were avoiding when you rejected that love. What frightened you about that intimacy? ¿Qué te asustaba de ser completamente visto? Which parts of you did you feel could not be loved? These questions do not have easy answers, and you won't find them in your first session of reflection. But if you keep asking, if you keep observing with honesty, your unconscious will begin revealing answers. Segundo, necesitas trabajar con tus sueños. Jung pioneered the interpretation of dreams not as fixed symbols that always mean the same thing, but as personalized messages from your unconscious specifically for you. Start keeping a dream journal. Every morning, as soon as you wake, write what you dreamed, without judging, without editing. Over time, you will see patterns emerge, recurring symbols that point exactly to where you need to direct your conscious attention. Your psyche is constantly trying to guide you back to wholeness. Dreams are one of its primary languages. Tercero, necesitas explorar lo que Jung llamó imaginación activa. This is a technique he developed in which you enter a state of deep relaxation while remaining conscious, allowing images, symbols, and even inner dialogues to emerge spontaneously. You could, for example, imagine an encounter with the person you rejected, not to redo the story, but to dialogue with what they represent in your psyche. ¿Qué les dicen a ti? ¿Qué dices a ellos? ¿Qué emociones surgen? ¿Qué insights aparecen? This is not an intellectual exercise. It is a deep practice of connecting with layers of your being that are normally blocked by rational thought. Cuarto, y esto es esencial, necesitas desarrollar lo que Jung llamó la función inferior. Each of us has dominant psychological functions, preferred ways of relating to the world, thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition. But we also have an inferior function, the least developed, and it is precisely this function that a soulmate often activates and challenges. If you are very rational, the soulmate probably connected you with deep feelings you didn't know how to handle. Si eres altamente intuitivo, quizás te pidieron que fueras más presente en el concreto, en el sensorial. Identify your inferior function and dedicate conscious time to developing it. Read about it, practice specific exercises, seek experiences that activate it. Jung creyó que la individuación requiere desarrollar todas nuestras funciones, no solo aquellas que vienen naturalmente. Quinto, seriamente considere trabajar con alguien que entienda psicología de la profundidad, idealmente con una orientación junguiana. This work is not easily done alone. You need a witness, someone who can see your blind spots, someone who can hold space as you pass through the hardest parts of this process. Jung himself underwent analysis and analyzed others throughout his professional life. Él entendió que la psique tiene capas que son muy difíciles de acceder sin la presencia de otro ser humano consciente que pueda reflejar lo que usted no puede ver por sí mismo. There is something Jung repeated constantly in his work that you need to hear now. The suffering you are experiencing for having rejected your soulmate is not your enemy. It is your most powerful teacher. Jung habló del valor del sufrimiento consciente, el dolor que sientes completamente, que no intentas entumir con distracciones, adicciones o relaciones superficiales. When you suffer consciously, when you allow yourself to feel the loss, the regret, the longing, without fleeing, something deep transforms within you. You become more real, more human, more capable of compassion toward yourself and others. Conscious suffering breaks you in necessary ways. It dissolves the ego defenses that kept you small and afraid. Jung also understood something many ignore. Sometimes we reject a soulmate not because we don't love them, but because we love them too much. So much that the intensity frightens us. There are loves that confront us with our own capacity to feel, with our own vitality, with our own power, and that can be terrifying to an ego that has learned to stay safe by staying small. If this is your case, if you rejected that love because it showed you dimensions of yourself you didn't know how to inhabit, then your task is to learn to expand your capacity to contain intensity. No solo intensidad emocional, sino la intensidad de la vida, presencia, autenticidad. This brings us to something Jung considered fundamental: the difference between living from the ego and living from the self. The ego is the part of you that identifies with your personal story, your social roles, your image of how you should be. The self, what Jung called the self, is that deeper center of your totality that includes the conscious and the unconscious, the light and the dark, the acceptable and the unacceptable. When you reject a soulmate, it is almost always the ego making that decision out of fear. The self, by contrast, knows that growth requires risk, requires leaving the known. Your work now is to listen less to the ego and more to the self. How do you do that? It requires silence, moments of deep solitude in which you can feel what lies beyond your habitual thoughts, what is calling you from a truer place. Jung escribió acerca del concepto de sincronía, aquellos momentos en los que las coincidencias significativas parecen guiarte, cuando el universo parece estar hablando directamente contigo. After rejecting a soulmate, pay attention to synchronicities. Perhaps you keep encountering references to that person in inexplicable ways. Perhaps certain symbols or numbers appear repeatedly. Jung didn't see this as magic, but as the way the psyche, when deeply activated, begins to perceive patterns of meaning we normally overlook. These synchronicities can be important messages about the path you need to take. You also need to understand that part of this process involves grieving, not only for the person, but for the life you could have lived, for the versión de ti que pudo haber sido. Jung habló de cómo cada elección que hacemos también implica una muerte, la muerte de todos los demás caminos posibles. When you reject a soulmate, you are choosing one path and letting another die. That other path needs to be mourned, honored, before you can truly move forward. Give yourself permission to feel the sadness, the regret, the loss. Do not minimize them with rationalizations like everything happens for a reason or there are plenty of fish in the sea. Those phrases only block the real grieving process your soul needs to go through. And finally, Jung constantly reminded us that life has phases, cycles, seasons. Perhaps you rejected that soulmate simply because it wasn't the right moment in your developmental process. Perhaps you needed to live certain experiences first, learn certain lessons, develop a certain maturity. This does not erase the consequences of that rejection, but it can help you have compassion for yourself. Individuation is not linear. It has advances and setbacks, moments of clarity and moments of total confusion. What matters is not being perfect on your path, but continuing to walk it consciously, continuing to pay attention, continuing to choose growth over comfort again and again. What Jung understood better than almost anyone in his time, and what remains radically relevant today, is that the human psyche seeks meaning even more than it seeks pleasure. When you reject a soulmate, what you are truly rejecting is a deep source of meaning in your life, and without sufficient meaning, life becomes unbearable. No matter how many material comforts or external successes you have, your task now, if you have rejected that love, is to find meaning in the process of understanding why you did it, in the work of integrating what that decision revealed about you, in the journey of becoming someone who can eventually hold that level of connection without running away. That is work rich with meaning. That is a path worth walking.